Okay, thank you, and welcome to all of you to this webinar. My name is Klaus Gruber. Um, I used to be a sponsorship agreement holder representative for the Anglican Diocese of Saskatoon. I've been involved with refugees in one way or another since 1979. I won't go into a lot of details. In addition, I am a social worker and have been for almost 50 years. And some of the work I've done has been in inpatient and outpatient mental health facilities and dealing with mental health issues. So I hope that I can be somewhat helpful to you today. I know that you face many different kinds of challenges, and I will try to address some of the major components, and we'll see what kinds of questions arise, and hopefully we can get to them as well. I was thinking as I was preparing for this, why are we all here? And of course, we're here because at the heart of everything, we are caregivers. We are caregivers. Some of us have been paid caregivers or are. Some of us are caregivers because we're family members. Some of us are caregivers because for social justice reasons. But ultimately, we are caregivers. And we're not ordinary caregivers because the populations that we're serving are some of the most vulnerable populations in the world. Refugees, by definition, are incredibly vulnerable. They cannot be where they would prefer to be, which is at home, and they are inevitably reliant on the goodwill of other people, and that generates, that lack of control generates a whole lot of challenges. In addition to that, we work in systems that usually have severe limits, sometimes are dysfunctional, and it begins to limit our own capacity for doing the things that we think we need to do or would like to do. So it challenges and stresses us as well. And furthermore, many of the people that we end up helping, especially those that arrive in Canada, and of course the ones that don't, but we don't get to meet them so much, they are often very damaged. They have seen and experienced and lived things that are beyond what most of us should ever have to deal with. And many of them are damaged, and others are extremely vulnerable when they arrive in Canada, if they get that far. So there are various physical and emotional injuries that we deal with in our caregiving, and we also need to be aware of how that impacts on us and how that stresses our mental health systems, our own mental health. We will be talking more about that in tomorrow's webinar that deals with vicarious trauma. But today I'm hoping that I can try to cover the basics of mental health. How do we understand mental health? What is it? What affects it? What are the outcomes if the human psyche is stressed sufficiently? And how can we help protect the people that we're caregiving for? How can we protect ourselves? And if people have suffered and have developed certain kinds of symptoms and problems, how can we help restore them to health to the extent that we are able to? So mental health is a variant on health itself. Now, when we think about health, we usually think about physical health, our bodies, how they work, what goes wrong with the ways in which we can develop a healthy system. The human body is an amazing thing. We begin with a single cell, and it has in it a genetic code that instructs the cell, which then divides into 2 and then 4 and then 8. And as it divides, some cells specialize and become skin cells or blood cells or bone cells or brain cells or organ cells, and each of those has a function. It is really quite astounding that the body can do all of those functions. And under normal conditions, the body, the baby, when it's born, will be healthy and will be capable of managing all of the tasks that it has to become a fully functioning human being. And traditionally, health has been, the health systems that were developed primarily to deal with things that go wrong in the system. Now, we have begun to rethink this in recent decades and started to look at not just waiting until something goes wrong, but looking at how we can promote and support healthy the development that results in good health. So emphasis on prevention and things like nutrition and lifestyle choices and those kinds of things that make positive and healthy development possible. And in terms of mental health, this is, of course, the same process. We have, in our mental development, we have many milestones that we have to achieve, which create in us the capacity to think and make decisions, to develop and carry out plans, to engage with others, to manage our emotions, and have the resilience that allows us to recover from the quote-unquote normal crises that we experience in day-to-day living, and the resilience to manage certain kinds of personal challenges. Of course, we all know that there are limits both to our physical body and to our emotional self and our psychological self that all of us could, under sufficient pressure and with enough assault on our person, we can crumble both physically and or mentally. One of the things that manages our mental health functioning is our mind, which is essentially an abstract concept that encapsulates the brain, which is instructing the rest of the body about things and responding to the external world by monitoring and managing our biochemistry and our movement, as well as our thinking, our feeling, our motivations. And the mind needs to also develop, even though it's an abstract concept. There's some developmental processes that are involved in the mind. So getting back to the definitions of mental health, the World Health Organization states that says that mental health is a state of being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So we have historically just sort of called that being normal, being being sane, being able to manage oneself, being of sound mind. Those are all kind of languages that we've used for mental health, and certainly the modern notions about mental health are, whether it's in the World Health Organization or different countries have different ways of seeing that, different health systems, but it all kind of results in the same kind of normality. So in both health and mental health, we think about, well, here's the next slide is one that also looks at some of the functions of people who have good mental health. So it's the ability to manage most of life's normal demands. And again, the term normal keeps showing up. Reality testing skills. Now, reality testing skills are more functions of the mind, and that is being able to differentiate between something that is true and something that is not true. So reality testing is, particularly in mental health, is something we think about, especially when people have serious mental illnesses. To determine how serious some of those mental illnesses are, we try to find out if somebody is imagining something, do they have the capacity to test what they're thinking or believing or feeling against reality? So if I have a delusion that I've developed that there are people following me and there are people that from outer space who are trying to control my thoughts and so on, what is my capacity to test that against what's really happening? And of course, the more disturbed or the more ill somebody is, the less capacity they have for reality testing. Mental health also involves the capacity to develop and maintain relationships. Not that everybody wants a relationship. And there are some people who go throughout their lives and remain loners, and that doesn't mean they're sick. But to the extent that people want relationships, the ability to develop and maintain them is an important element of mental health. The ability to access, manage, and regulate emotions is also incredibly complicated, but also incredibly important. People who cannot regulate their emotions often get out of control. They often get themselves into difficulty because they cannot stop their when their emotions are beginning to exaggerate or become problematic for them. They don't have a way to self-soothe, to settle themselves down, to come back into some kind of a moderate level of emotions. So, for example, if somebody cuts us off in traffic, we might become irritated, we might even become very angry. But if somebody doesn't have the capacity to regulate their emotions, they may end up following the person that cut them off, trying to run them off the road, or stopping them somehow and trying to engage in some kind of a fight. That's usually somebody who can't, especially in the emotion of anger, cannot regulate that emotion. But we need to regulate sadness as human beings. We need to regulate all kinds of emotions. So finally, we also need to be capable of decision making that enhances well-being. but does not hurt others. So having self-interest and being able to manage our self-interest is critical to our mental health, but it's also important that we are able to do that without infringing on other people's territory and other people's mental health. So every culture has thoughts about and stories about and various explanations of mental health. Of course, there are family stories, narratives about what mental health is and what's normal and what's not. There are cultural descriptions and definitions of what's okay. And we have developed in almost every culture responses to people who don't fall within the norm, for people who are, it would be described as not normal. And often those responses are hostile. We fear what we don't understand, and people who are eccentric in certain ways, people who are outside the norm, are often people that somehow create fear in us. And we have and continue to treat them often with discrimination. They're ostracized, they're sometimes imprisoned, they're brutalized. And the stigma of having a mental illness or having some kind of a mental condition or difference causes a lot more problems from the stigma that's attached to it and the way in which people are treated if they have that. So people have over the years thought about people with mental health concerns or issues as being possessed by evil spirits, having angered gods, being immoral, being punished for past sins, and so on. It is almost always a condition of shame, which of course has complicated things dramatically, because with shame also comes hiding and withdrawal, and people who are shamed then don't engage, and engagement is necessary for mental health. So just like in physical health, health systems have developed charts and schematics about the determinants of health. And there are also determinants of mental health. As I said in the beginning, our body seems to know what to do and gets about the business of doing it under normal circumstances. And often, most often, surprisingly often, the outcome is positive. The outcome is that people are functional and well functioning and so on. But we also know that functioning can be enhanced in some ways, and it can also be disturbed in some ways. And these are the various things that contribute to either improving our mental health or interfering with our mental health. Now, some of these things happen at an individual level. We all begin with a genetic code, and sometimes the genetic code is somehow has glitches in it. Just like if you think of your computer, when it's working, it's wonderful. If it has a glitch, things go wrong, and they can't always be fixed. Genetics is extremely complicated, and unfortunately, I'm not a geneticist. My wife is, but I don't. I can't describe in detail. But we all have a genetic code, and that code determines to some extent how well our mental health will become and stay, and where our vulnerabilities to mental health issues occur. Now, it used to be believed that the genetic code was an absolute. If you had certain genes, you will almost certainly become schizophrenic. There are a number of conditions that have a much greater genetic component than others. But what we have come to understand in the last decade or two is something that's called epigenetics. And epigenetics involves how our environment imposes itself on our genetic structure. And it doesn't change the core genetic code, but it can positively or negatively impact on how the genes express themselves in the system, and the result can be an improvement in mental health or conversely more mental health problems. So genetics is one piece that impacts on us. When I worked in mental health, one of the things that was interesting to me is that very often, if somebody developed a mental disorder such as depression or bipolar disorder, it wasn't unusual for somebody in their genetic history also had some history of depression or bipolar disorder. And psychiatrists would often ask what kind of medication that their mother, for example, or their father who had the same disorder, what kind of medication they used and did it work. And often if it did work with the parent, it also worked with the child. So you can almost see the evidence of the genetic component at work there. There are other things, of course. Physical health has a huge impact on mental health. And when I say physical health, it's not just being an able-bodied person or not having any disabilities, but much of our physical health and even more of our mental health is dependent on the biochemistry of the body, the hormones working as well as possible. And so, for example, many mental health disturbances are related to thyroid or are related to even gut, our diet, and how our nutritional systems are working, and the digestive systems and so on. So physical health it has a lot to do with mental health, and it's often in biochemistry, and it's also in brain structure and the way the neurons have connected and developed the proper capacity to function and instruct the body what to do. In the last few decades, again, the quality of brain scans and the ability of doctors, psychiatrists, and so on to study the brain, it has been a very, very powerful area of exploration, and they can now use that in some of the treatment that's being applied. Our cognitive ability, some people have developmental delays, which means that they simply are not keeping up in their ability to think, or they may be limited in their ultimate capacity to think. We used to call that retardation. In some of the literature it still is, but there are a number of different elements that can interfere with cognitive ability. And that would also interfere with mental health substantially. Not always negatively, but certainly sometimes. Now, there are many other things on this chart that you can see that reside sort of in the individual or the individual response to societal issues. For example, gender is a very complex thing at several levels. One is we have historically thought of gender as being a binary condition, that everybody is either male or female. We now know that it's much more complicated than that, and there are people struggling with their understanding of themselves as a male or a female, and there are people who have the physical, certain physical elements that are both male and female, or they have male characteristics in a female body and vice versa. There's a wonderful video that was created, a documentary that was created in 1979, and we knew so much less about gender back then. But it began with the study of a small remote island where at about age 13, 14, a substantial percentage of the girls became boys. And it then looks at all the biochemical issues that come to play in determining our gender. And our gender is it's also a societal construct. So if people don't fit neatly into a gender profile, then of course that can be tremendously difficult, especially in a society that such as ours, where and many others, where genders are hierarchical. The male gender is more often valued and preferred, and there are many ways in which female women are discriminated against, and that discrimination has substantial impact on their mental health and so on. So there are lots of those kinds of issues that can increase your mental health or decrease your mental health. Your personality, there are many different types of personality, and we have often, if somebody is acting in a way that's very different from the way we act, we will all often look at that and say, well, there's something wrong with them. So for example, if you have an office mate who is a slob and you happen to be somebody who is very organized and likes to have everything well organized, that can end up resulting in a great deal of interpersonal conflict, because the assumption is that one way of doing things is right and one way of doing things is wrong. And the person who is not all that well organized might be perfectly comfortable in an environment where things are more casual and more disorganized, and often people who are disorganized have their own way of managing that and understanding that, and to them it's not an issue or a problem. But to others, whether it's a partner or, like I said, an office mate or whatever, may just find it difficult. And most companies these days, when they have retreats and when they have training sessions, they often do personality tests, and people get to understand sometimes that being different isn't necessarily being bad, or one person being right and the other person wrong. It's just, that's just the way that some people are. Some people are one way and some people are another way, and that's not a problem unless we make it so. But often we make it a problem, and then it really can become a significant issue for mental health. So there are many things individually that impact on our mental health positively or negatively. Trauma, of course, is listed there, and trauma we'll talk about more in tomorrow's session. But trauma is one of the biggest risks to mental health, that almost all of us with enough trauma and the right kind of trauma, almost all of us are vulnerable to some major challenges to our mental health. Trauma, of course, it results in incredible biochemical. Our system is out of kilter biochemically quite a bit, and there's fear and threats, and those kinds of things are really powerful in terms of impacting on our sense of control and our ability to manage ourselves in situations of trauma, which include conflict, war, imprisonment, torture, all of those kinds of things. The people in those situations are out of control and feel out of control, and that usually results in enormous pain and fear, and it breaks down the resilience that people start with, and it can be horrendously damaging, as you'll see. Families are usually a very, very helpful thing for our mental health, because our mental health, to some extent, is based on our belonging, our sense of belonging, our sense of being valued, our sense of having somebody in our corner, having somebody who has our back and protects us, and that the kind of security that breeds mental health, positive mental health, often comes from families. However, if families themselves are abusive, if families are ridden with conflict, or if families come apart, that can be very challenging to one's self-concept, to one's self-esteem, and to one's or sense of continuity and hope for the future, and so on. So those are. And when you look at the refugee population, of course, many of these things will pop out at you: the trauma, the separation of family members, the constant risk, and so on. These are things that are ever present in the refugee journey. Not to mention, and I will mention in a few minutes, the losses that most refugees suffer, and the kind of challenge that presents for their mental health. So at a broader environmental perspective, people's socioeconomic status, their access to education, their discrimination and harassment, and those kinds of things, the nature of their neighborhood, their social activities, their connection to peers, all of those things will have a positive effect if they are positive events. If somebody is free from discrimination, that'll be positive. If somebody is regularly discriminated against, of course, that will be a challenge to one's mental health. So these are substantial things that we can think about when we're trying to assess people's vulnerability to mental health issues, and when we're trying to understand people's mental health challenges. Some of the concepts in mental health that have existed over the years, I mean, one of them has to do with sanity. Are people sane or insane? And that's a bit of a vague concept, even though it's used a great deal. And there's some wonderful research back in the 50s where a social psychologist sent colleagues and students who he had trained into hospitals to determine whether or not they were sane. But they were all instructed to present the investigators, the intake people. They were to present certain symptomatic things, language, several words that they keep hearing. They were supposed to say that they heard voices, and the voices said certain things that show up sometimes in people who have psychosis. But once they were diagnosed, they were supposed to drop all of that. And indeed, they were supposed to be honest about everything else, all the other, family history and those kinds of things that one gets questioned about when one is in a mental health facility. All of them were admitted to hospital, some against their will, and they remained for some time. As a matter of fact, he had to intervene to get some of them released. So the issue, or the result of this experiment was the idea that really we can't discern sanity from insanity. So it's not a very helpful distinction. It's not people move between conditions and so on. And that's the same with normal versus abnormal. We often value people who are normal, but frankly, many people who are abnormal, the people who are exceptional in some field or another, are a boon to society and are very healthy themselves. So that's, again, not a particularly helpful piece of language. And then, of course, mental health versus mental illness. Mental illness has been, in the last 100 years at least, trying to diagnose whether someone has a mental illness has been something that's been developing a great deal, and is in a better place than it once was. But still, there are many people who have mental health challenges, but who do not have a mental illness. So again, we have to be careful about, we need to understand for ourselves, how do we view mental illness and how do we view mental health, and how do we discern whether somebody is acting under tremendous stress or is responding to some internal processes that we don't quite understand, but the person can't be described as mentally ill. So those kinds of things become important in large part because we have still such a stigma for people who have what we think is a mental illness. There are two current documents that help mental health professionals determine whether or not someone is mentally ill and what their illness is. One of them is used in North America primarily, and that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. And that is a publication of the American Psychiatric Association, and it is in its 5th revision. The first one emerged after the Second World War, when there were many people who had mental health challenges as a result of the war, and others as well. But that one had, I think, 108 pages, and had about 100 diagnoses. The 5th edition now is 800 pages, and it has so many mental illnesses and variances on mental illness that it's very hard to manage. The second one is used globally more, and that's the International Classification of Diseases, and it's in its 11th printing revision, and that came out last year. And there's a great deal of overlap in those two documents, and there is an increased understanding of what mental illness might be, but it's certainly still not definitive, so we'll have to keep watching that. But the major mental illnesses involve several categories of illnesses. One is anxiety disorders. Now, people have, many people have anxiety disorders, and that simply means that people are in fear of certain circumstances. So it might be anxiety before you do a presentation. It might be anxiety about getting into an elevator or crossing a bridge or seeing a snake or whatever. And anxiety disorders are physical conditions where the body is, because of evolutionary processes, it is responding to a perceived threat. Whether the threat is real or not isn't relevant to the body. The body just, if the mind thinks that something is a threat, the body will increase its heart rate, will tense the muscles, will do release certain kinds of hormones that all have a historic evolutionary process, but they are experienced as a great deal of discomfort. Generalized anxiety disorder is people having great difficulties in social situations and or generally having an anxious personality where it's hard for them to kind of self-soothe and settle down, and sometimes that can get out of control so that people cannot easily function. So phobias are also part of that anxiety disorder system. Mood disorders are probably the most common disorders, and they involve some of the most common mental illnesses. One of them being depression. And again, depression is not the same as being sad. It's not the same as lacking emotion, lacking motivation. It is a complex process, and it's partially biochemical and partially involves our internal self-talk and what we say to ourselves that essentially brings down our mood. In its worst condition, depression can be almost totally debilitating, where people cannot get themselves out of bed, cannot motivate themselves to do anything, get anything done, and so on. And to people who don't understand mental health and the seriousness of mental health, this can be very frustrating because it can look like a lack of willingness or resistance or acting, or people are just not trying hard enough. So it's really important to understand that for some people, this is not only real, it's always real, but this is serious, and it's something they can no longer control. And that's why often we need to involve mental health professionals and possibly medication. Medication is often something that can be helpful. especially in mood disorders and bipolar disorder, or what we used to call manic depression. People shift from one state, which is depression and being sort of incapable of functioning at one level, to a manic phase, which is where people have boundless energy, are tremendously overcompetent, and often can stay awake and be doing active things for several days at a time. Unfortunately, they almost always then crash into a depression and deep depression. So these are mental disorders or mental illnesses that are outside of the normal ebb and flow that we all go through. All of us have series of mild depressions or anxiety or some of the other things that we'll talk about in a moment. But once they get to a certain level, they almost all need some kind of intervention. Now, psychotic disorders are the things that distress us the most, probably, because people who are psychotic or have psychotic elements are people who have delusions. These are belief systems not grounded in reality, but are thoroughly fixed in a person's mind. These are ideas that somebody has developed somehow and believes to their core, and they cannot be talked out of their delusions and so on. Psychotic people or people with psychosis are also often out of touch with reality. They may not know who they are or who the people they're talking to are. So they may see something that in somebody that makes them think that they're a threat or an enemy. They may even not recognize or see who they're talking to, and so on. And they may have hallucinations. They may see angels, they may see devils, they may see lots of things that are not there. And people with psychotic disorders, and schizophrenia is one example of a psychotic disorder that people get, are in deep trouble, and they cannot, again, easily be treated simply by behavioral interventions or talking and so on. Now, people can help, can learn, even with major mental illnesses, can learn how to manage their symptoms, but they often need the help of some medication because their biochemistry is out of whack, and bringing that back into a functional state can then help them manage their lives better. Eating disorders are, again, very distressing disorders. They are, however, to some extent also connected to culture. Eating disorders are a kind of a Western disorder in North America and Europe. The most dangerous eating disorder is anorexia, where people have developed a sense that they are overweight and that they have to continuously focus all of their energy on reducing their weight, and that may include compulsively exercising and limiting their food to almost nothing. And in fact, there are people who die from anorexia nervosa because they continue to eat and drive their body into non-functioning, continue to not eat and overdrive their body with exercise and so on until it finally collapses and so on. There are some other eating disorders and binge eating and bulimia, which is eating and then throwing up so that you're not gaining weight. And most of those things have this delusional system where my body is the enemy and my body's too big, and when they look in the mirror, they don't see what we would see if we looked at them. They see something different and something that's repulsive and has to change, and so their focus is quite distorted. Again, these are not that common, although they are more common than they ought to be, perhaps. But they are also impacted by society and advertising and you know, the fashion advertising and all those kinds of things, which and they're much more common in women than men, because a lot of advertising that denigrates the human body has been done using women rather than men, and making women feel like there's something wrong with them because of how they look and so on. So it's a societal problem that we sort of need to tackle. Impulse control and addiction disorders. There are many different kinds of compulsive disorders that people somehow can't stop themselves, whether it's a gambling addiction or an alcohol or drug addiction, or whether it's a need to steal things from grocery store or from stores, or starting fires, gambling addictions. All of these are driven by an inability to control impulses and a chronic craving to do something, whatever that something is. And again, many of us have bad habits that are not easy to quit. Smoking or biting fingernails or those kinds of things, but they're not. And I mean, smoking is harmful, but it's not harmful in the sense that you eventually stop thinking about your relationships, your obligations, or other kinds of things, which happens when somebody, for example, has a gambling addiction and may end up losing family and friends and job, and maybe going to jail if they end up having to you know, steal money to you know, deal with their gambling losses and so on. Personality disorders, that's another very complicated set of disorders, and that has to do with how our system is able to it exaggerates certain elements of a personality and shifts to a particular point that it takes over somebody's functioning. So, for example, paranoid personality disorder is somebody who is chronically suspicious of everything, of everybody, and regardless of whether there's evidence or not, believes that they're being followed, they're being somehow manipulated, and so on. Many times that gets to the point where somebody may need to be hospitalized or whatever. Antisocial personality disorder, which includes what we have called in the past psychopathic behavior or sociopaths, and antisocial personalities. People with antisocial personality disorder find themselves in opposition to most other people and their goals and needs, and they don't have any capacity to develop empathy for victims. They tend to become involved with crime and so on, and they don't have any of the moderating ability that the rest of us have, who simply do not engage in behaviors that will hurt other people. People who have an antisocial personality disorder often just don't care. So these are some of the major disorders. Obsessive compulsive disorder is something that, again, is not that common, but it involves people who are plagued by constant thoughts or fears that cause them to perform certain rituals or routines. So they have a belief that, for example, that they are going to get or give to someone else some kind of disease or infection. So they compulsively wash their hands over and over and over and over again, multiple times in a day, or sometimes multiple times in an hour. Or they have a ritual that they maintain, where if they get to step 3 of their ritual and something interferes with it, they always have to start over again. There are a lot of ways in which this obsessive compulsive behavior plays itself out, but it's distressing, disturbing, it's distressing for people around. It's not so distressing for the person who has it, because they're so focused on their rituals and so on. They don't have the requisite self-awareness, but it is a major problem. Now, post-traumatic stress disorder is another major mental illness. And again, it's very real. It's a condition that can develop following any kind of traumatic event or terrifying event, and it's very subjective. I mean, some of us might have something happen to us that's powerful, but we may have the resilience to not be overwhelmed by it. But other people may, of course, become overwhelmed by it, whether it's a physical assault or the death of a loved one, or being involved in an accident, or even almost being involved in an accident can result in PTSD. If your mind imagines what could have happened and then gets focused on what could have happened, and then you get more and more afraid. Some people can't drive because they almost had an accident once or whatever. Natural disasters. There are many things that are involved with developing post-traumatic stress disorder, but it can very seriously impact on your life, and it almost always results in some sleep challenges and sleep deprivation, which can be a significant problem for people, and that also reduces your resilience and increases your vulnerability to mental health issues. So the reason that I went through a lot of that is not because most of us are going to become mental health specialists, or that we need to intervene in these kinds of things. It's really important, though, that we recognize some of the different things that might show up in a mild form, or even in a significant form, and that we, that we might have to deal with the refugees that come to us. Even with the people who are supporting refugees, because and that includes us, but it could be family members that we're engaged with, or friends that we're engaged with, who are also wearing down from the kinds of stresses that the refugees bring. And we also need to be able to monitor our own moods and our ability to manage some of the ways in which hearing the stories and having to deal with people who are distressed and or damaged and or having great difficulty, because that may play itself out in behavior that's aggressive, or may play itself out in withdrawal or chronic fear, or an unwillingness of refugees to move forward because they're too afraid, or all of those kinds of things will have an impact on us and our own mental health. So just kind of learning how to be monitoring the moods of the people we're trying to help and our own moods to see whether or not there's something changing, something shifting in moods and so on. So one of the things we need to do is recognize that refugees have gone through and have had to deal with tremendously horrible, traumatic events. Not all refugees, and every refugee story is different, but chances are they have all been traumatized in one way or another, sometimes more, sometimes less. So it would be really helpful if we're expecting refugees to be arriving to get information about their pre-trauma mental health, because sometimes people had mental health issues before they were traumatized. And so knowing kind of the sequential things and how things have helped, how things have worked is probably helpful. And also, if there's somebody who knows the refugees, again, if you're working with families or whatever, getting information from them about what they know about the family and who's in a best situation to monitor shifts and changes in moods and so on. What is the refugee's baseline is what I'm asking. It's also important that we get to know the mental health services that are available in our communities. Most major communities, larger communities have lots of help, not always with the right kind of cultural focus and translation available, and so on, but local settlement agencies can often help with that. But lots of rural communities don't have good health services, so you may have to find things online, or you may have to find things in neighboring communities and so on. It's important to stay connected with refugees overseas while they're waiting, and reassuring them that efforts are continue to help them to get here, especially if some things are going wrong, because what you don't want, if possible, is for all the mental health challenges to be exacerbated, because during the waiting time, people don't know what's going on, and that is, the lack of control is very, very powerful in terms of mental health challenges. So if somebody in a sponsoring group can be in contact with people from time to time, monitor what's going on for them, and keeping them informed of the legal process and so on. And again, you can't always satisfy people, but just again, remembering them and connecting with them can be very helpful. It's also really important not to make promises that you cannot keep. So again, people are often asking us, when will this happen, or what can, what will happen, and we don't know, but we can give them some history and some cautious optimism and so on. When we're dealing with people who may have mental health issues, we need to invite them to describe how they are coping and what strategies they're contemplating, what resources they have. This is still overseas, for example. Some people may say, well, I'm done in Turkey, I want to go to Lebanon. Well, okay, have you thought it through? What are the challenges? What's going to work, what's not going to work? So having that kind of ongoing dialogue can be very helpful to people. Upon arrival here in Canada, of course, getting to understand people's personalities and individual histories, and then being able to monitor for changes of mood and watching for signs of regression or positive things in their mood and so on. It's also helpful to understand how people view mental health from their culture and their system. If you have family members, they can probably tell you that, but also knowing what systems within the culture and within the community to involve if someone has a mental health issue can also be helpful. So these are some of the things to watch for: fear, anxiety, withdrawal, engagement with family, religious community, and so on, and agitation, aggression, belligerence, oddities, changes in family dynamics. These are all things that are signals that maybe we need to look more closely and have some conversation about mental health issues. It is important, I'm thinking specifically about the PTSD kinds of responses. It's in our instinct to want people to tell us what's happened to them. It's also very important for them to be able to talk about things that have happened to them. However, we always also need to recognize that them talking about it is going to be painful, and it might take them back into a circumstance that they can't control, and it can be very, very powerful. So we need to be very careful not to pressure them or somehow imply that they have to talk to us about some of their powerful experiences. It's very, very important that they do that when they're ready, but it's always helpful to let them know that you're willing to listen and that you will be okay if they talk about it, and that there's a safe space for them to talk about it without having any kind of repercussions and so on. And if you do get into that kind of discussion, dialogue, conversation, and if you're comfortable, you can ask about sleeping patterns, eating habits, recreational activity-related things, affiliations, because that will all help you develop a bit of a picture of the person's functioning. Isolation, sleep deprivation, reduction in motivation and/or engagement, and alteration of moods are all little yellow flags and maybe even red flags, depending on how they're happening and so on. So depending on your relationship and role with the family, you can ask family about stresses and dynamics within the family, and ask about plans and wishes and look for signs of hope. It's very important that when people are disclosing things to us, that we not respond with a positive or negative response. A positive response like this: wow, this makes me really happy that you're doing okay, or whatever. What we don't want is for them to think we have expectations, and so if they're not happy, they shouldn't tell us about it because we expect them to be happy, or any of those kinds of things. So we want to try to be as neutral as we can in our responses, but certainly not negative. But the kinds of responses are, oh, you must be feeling good about this particular thing that happened, or about this particular revelation, or about this particular circumstance. Or if it's a negative thing, you can also respond with, I think it's probably helpful for you that you've been able to talk about it. I hope it's been helpful to you that you've been able to talk about. I want you to know that I'll continue to support you in these struggles. And if you want, I can give you some ideas about how this could be resolved, or whatever. But it again, if people sense that we're shocked or overwhelmed or too engaged or too connected to their outcome, then that will likely make it more difficult for them to share their innermost feelings and things. So I would like to stop here because I suspect that there may be some questions, and we're running quickly out of time. So I'm just going to stop and see what people might want me to react to.